I'm Olenka Kacperczyk, and I'm currently a professor of entrepreneurship and strategy at London Business School. So just in terms of my background and the academic journey that I have made, so I was born and raised in Poland, and then I left to Canada to do my high school, and then subsequently from there I studied in the US, and I got my PhD in management and organizations from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. From there, then, my first job was at MIT Sloan Business School, and I was there as junior faculty for, I guess, about 7 years. After that, I then moved back to Europe. Since I'm European, I came back to Europe, and now I'm a professor at London Business School. So my research interests in general evolve around this idea of entrepreneurship, individual mobility, social inequality as well. And so some of it also is informed by questions around sustainability, questions around stakeholder management. Now, in terms of kind of how I came to really think of those issues, I think for me, the biggest motivator was really my family. And so it really comes down to this personal interest that's inspired by observing my parents, my dad in particular, having founded his company after the fall of communism. My sister is an entrepreneur as well, and so I really grew up in a family of entrepreneurs. I've been always exposed, and I'm still currently exposed to this entrepreneurial dynamic and really people who are passionate thinking about entrepreneurial issues. Now, what's interesting about the Polish context was that really after the fall of communism, there was no formal economy anymore. So everything crumbled within Poland. And so entrepreneurship was really a path for a lot of people to get by because the other opportunities were severely constrained. And so I think since then, it really made me think about entrepreneurship as this alternative pathway for people to advance, for people to really be able to make a living when other options in the formal economy are not quite available. And so in that sense, I have kind of came to realize that entrepreneurship has this promise of not only providing a security of the income, but also really helping people make their living in tough economies and tough situations. Now, having said all that, of course, it also means that growing up in this kind of family, you're constantly exposed to all the downsides and all the challenges that entrepreneurship also involves. And so we always think of entrepreneurship as this kind of idealized path, and it's often romanticized, especially in the West and popular culture. But really, when you think about the complexity of this phenomenon, then you quickly realize that, well, it's also something that actually is very challenging, and you have to navigate day-to-day difficulties. And, we know that entrepreneurs might be more likely to get divorced, they might be more likely to be depressed. There's a lot of personal challenges that come with it. And so really thinking very carefully about, is that the path that you want to focus on or that you want to pursue, given all the challenges, thinking about what are the trade-offs for individuals who are actually involved in becoming founders. So that in part is also what really motivates my research. Is not only understanding when do you actually transition to entrepreneurship, but also understanding what are the consequences of those transitions. So what are the consequences for individuals who pursue entrepreneurship? And so with that, then I think comes this interest in social inequality. And so just like I've mentioned, I think I often think of entrepreneurship as this mechanism of creating wealth, of creating jobs. And so in some ways, we would like all individuals to be involved and all individuals to have access to entrepreneurial opportunities. But I think increasingly we know that this sort of access is constrained and it is unequally distributed across the different groups in the population. And so part of my research then also is about unpacking what are those groups that actually might not have an equal access to an entrepreneurial opportunity, and then subsequently, what can we do to facilitate that access? I think this question is really important, in part because we as academics, we often are working in our ivory towers, and we are excited by new theories, by new ideas, but then there's always that additional step, right, which is essentially about translating our findings into practical insights that can change how things are organized or arranged. And so I think it's a really important question to always sort of have that in mind and always think about how what we show, what we research might have practical relevance as well. So not only rigor, but also relevance. And so in my research, I often do think about this practical relevance and how what I find might actually then have implications for either sort of at many different levels, right? So implications first, I think, for thinking about how do we think about the choice of the entrepreneurial path from the get-go. And so in particular, one of the implications I think that I see in my research is that we often do focus on kind of promoting various initiatives to foster entrepreneurship. So we all work in business schools where there's a lot of emphasis on pushing students to pursue entrepreneurship. There's also government programs and incubators and accelerators to really encourage people to become founders. But I think in my research, one of the important implications is that, well, we might also want to think about what are kind of safer and alternative paths for entrepreneurs to sort of either start with or to pursue. And so in particular, one implication that I think is quite interesting pertains to intrapreneurship. So intrapreneurship is this kind of path of founding a new venture inside an organization, so with the security of a large firm, as well as the resources that a large firm provides. And so what we found in one project was that even though minorities, and here in particular it's racial minorities, tend to be underrepresented in entrepreneurship, they also tend to underperform in part due to biases of investors or other resource holders. What we found was that when it came to intrapreneurship, so the path that they would pursue internally by founding an internal venture, that disparity between minorities and non-minorities was much smaller. And so this was in part due to the fact that the resources were much more available. Also within the organization, productivity at the individual level can actually be much more easily assessed by the resource holders. And so in that sense, one important implication that I think we want to highlight is that, well, it might actually be easier in many instances to become an intrapreneur than an entrepreneur, and especially for minorities that are often being encouraged to leave the security of paid employment. It's worth thinking about that counterfactual path, which is essentially becoming an internal entrepreneur and doing it in a safer and often more effective way. So I think that's one. Another implication that I think by studying, that I sort of see by studying entrepreneurs and really the sort of disparities that we see pertains to the type of policies that we can actually put in place more specifically to make entrepreneurship more of a level playing field. And so here there's a bunch of insights that I would like to share. So one of them, in a recent project, we discovered, or we found that entry deregulation reforms, so those that actually lower barrier to entry in terms of lowering the funding that you need or lowering the time that's needed to start a new venture. So those type of deregulation reforms, they actually disproportionately help minorities. And so we thought that this is actually important because in some countries, so Europe is a primary example here. So in some countries in Europe, this type of entry deregulation reforms have been put in place to really stimulate entrepreneurial activity, to remove barriers to entrepreneurship. But I think one of the unintended consequences of that has been this idea that they facilitated disproportionately the entry of minority groups into entrepreneurship, often because these are the groups that suffer from disproportionate barriers, disproportionate disadvantages, and so they benefit more than other groups from these type of policies. And so I think at the policy level, it's actually really important to think about how we might have this lever at hand to really help minorities not only enter, but also then grow their ventures. For the kind of past few months, I've been also really interested in thinking not only about individuals, but also about firms and entrepreneurial firms in particular, because if we want to promote entrepreneurship, if we want to push people to become founders, and then we are hoping that this will actually ultimately lead to some societal benefits, then I think one question to ask is also about, well, I mean, by doing that, are we actually better off in terms of having so many startups around? So it's not only about the individuals, but also firms and employers. And I think with startups in particular, recently we know there has been a lot of concern around their specific practices. And it's not only about labor practices, it's also about startup misconduct and how they might actually fly under the radar, and they might not adhere to the same rules that incumbent firms do. And so I think, to my understanding, we have very little research currently on really trying to understand if, when, and how startups do fly under the radar, and should that be regulated? Should that be something that actually matter for the society as a whole? And so I think going forward, that'd be, I think, a very promising research direction, is to really kind of think about what are the specific types of misconduct, if at all, that startups engage in, and then what can we do to actually help them stay on the right course. I'm going to tackle this question in two ways. One is that to your specific question about how do we actually sort of multitask and maintain this kind of large portfolio of projects. So I think what I would say here is that there isn't one path only, right? And I think everyone really has to find what works for them. And so I'm always far from kind of giving anyone a recipe, because I hardly have a recipe for myself. And so it sort of seems like exposed things sometimes make sense, but ex ante I never really had any plan. And so it's kind of hard. Now, having said that, I will say that to me, some of the tips that have been quite useful are as follows. So I think the first one is that you really need to know yourself well. And what I mean by that is the first decision that's useful to make is what I would call, to paraphrase one of my colleagues actually from MIT, you need to choose between the so-called rows and columns. And so this term was coined by Roberto Fernandez, and essentially what he meant by that is that you can either be a scholar who is interested and focused on understanding phenomena, or you can instead really invest in being kind of a theory scholar. And so, for example, if you're a phenomenon scholar, like I think I am one of those, then you really focus on a specific phenomenon like entrepreneurship, and then you kind of study every aspect of it or whatever interests you about this phenomenon. Now, if you are a row scholar, then let's say you might be really interested in network theory. And then what you end up doing is you end up spinning think through a variety of contexts to study different phenomena, but always with this eye on understanding network dynamics. Now, why is it really important to make that choice probably early in your career? I think part of the idea here is that it's quite hard to be both at the same time. It's quite hard to write a paper that's focused on the phenomenon and also on this theory at the same time. And it's even harder to construct a portfolio, a research portfolio around both. And so I think at the get-go, it's kind of really important to make that particular choice, and both can be can work really well. So there isn't one path that's better than the other path. What's important is that you don't straddle, and so you pick between one of them. Now, I think having said that, I have also been a strong believer that it pays off to be the sort of T-shaped person, right? And so by T-shaped, we might think about merging the advantages of being a generalist, so someone who can span multiple things and be kind of conversant in a number of different topics, but also then with that you specialize in something in particular. And so I think in our profession we can see all the different profiles. So there are out there scholars who are the so-called I-shaped, so really very kind of vertical specialists. There are those who are generalists, so kind of horizontal line, and so they span a lot of different things. But then we also have those T-shaped people that have advantages in both. And I think the particular appeal of being a T-shaped scholar to me comes from the fact that there's something that you know really, really well, and it could be a method, it could be an approach, it could be a theory that you often are going to leverage across different projects. But at the same time, you're so broad that you're able to kind of converse with everyone and to be a bridge across different levels, to see connections across different topics and different projects. Often that also helps you create new ideas. So creativity comes from being a bridge. And so I think the way to think about it is that we might think about these different niches that people occupy with this particular attention of thinking about, well, can I actually at some level become that T-shaped scholar? Now, I would also say that I think increasingly what really matters is not only that we are or we become rigorous researchers, but also that we study topics that are socially impactful. And I think this is in part because when we think about in business schools, when we think about the actual investment into research, so I think there has been a recent paper at Wharton Business School that estimated, off the top of my head, I don't remember the number, but it's about 4 billion, I think, dollars over quite a short time investment in research for A publications. In other words, the point being that there's just a lot of resources that are being poured into the input of academic research within business schools. And so with that, I think it's not only anymore about publish or perish. We don't want to publish and perish, right? We actually want to study topics that are very relevant, that touch on important issues important to the society. And so I think that increasingly should be taken into consideration too. And I think this in particular, I think then feeds into this question you asked at the beginning, which is how do you keep being really productive? And that might not be surprising as an answer, but I think finding something that you're really committed to beyond just your career, beyond just kind of day-to-day job, something that really interests you. And it could be this question about social responsibility. It could be the question of like, I really want to contribute to the broader society in terms of providing a better understanding of an issue that I really care about. Because I think once you kind of frame your research agenda in this way and you become personally invested in finding out the truth, then I think the productivity is just kind of naturally gonna come in. And of course, research is tough, and it's tough because just like R&D, we see a lot of failures, right? And so I think it's unreasonable to expect that every single project that you'll undertake, that you'll pursue, will actually bear fruit, because just like R&D, there's just a lot of investments that will go nowhere. And it's in part because we might have a hypothesis, we might have a prediction, and then once it meets the data, we learn that it's not there, or we were wrong. And I think that's exactly fine, because had we known the answer beforehand, then it wouldn't be called research. And so I think in some ways, really understanding that failure is part of the process really helps staying motivated and really helps staying productive. I think what's difficult in our profession, of course, is that if we make those significant investments and the paper sometimes get rejected. So that at the personal level, I think is something that one needs to develop strategies to deal with. And I think no matter in what stage of this career you are, you always get upset about rejections, and it always pulls you down. So it never really gets better in that sense. But I think if you keep perspective, and if you think about this broader picture, that in the end you're working to discover the truth about the world, and in the end you're working towards a portfolio rather than any particular project. Once you start really framing this in that broader way, then I think any particular failure is just much easier to deal with. And maybe that also comes with time, because as you become more senior in this profession, any particular project matters less and less, and it is more really about the broader agenda that you pursue. But so I think the main conclusion from this, to me, the big takeaway is that if you become really invested in a topic, really curious, and even if the world stops, you're still gonna continue doing it, then I think the productivity will come naturally. I think one paper that I tend to like quite a bit, it's actually a working paper right now. It hasn't been published, fingers crossed, but I think outside of that, this is a paper that looks at income or wage inequality as a consequence of entrepreneurship. So in particular in the paper, we examine how lowering barriers to entrepreneurship in terms of cost, in terms of time that's needed to found a new venture, how that might actually increase income inequality in a region that introduced these type of policies. And so I think the paper, to me, is particularly important because, again, we often tend to think about the upsides, the positives of entrepreneurship, but we often focus much less on the potential downsides. Now, inequality, of course, depending who you ask, might be seen as a either positive or a negative force. The fact that we have a lot of income dispersion sometimes might also be motivating for individuals, for their productivity. So it's really kind of depends how we want to think about it. Nevertheless, I think showing the link directly between entrepreneurship and an increase in inequality in regions and communities that are engaged in entrepreneurship, I think to me that is an important question, important fact to really document. Beyond that, in this particular research project, we also document one of the mechanisms through which that happens. So I think it wouldn't be surprising to anyone if I say that entrepreneurship often results in greater inequality because startups fail, because gains accrue only to a very small share of individuals, those really successful founders. So we know that entrepreneurship results in the skewed distribution of income. However, in the paper, what we actually are able to observe is what happens within incumbent firms. So firms that are not really engaged in entrepreneurship, and yet they're subject to regulations and laws that allow or that foster entrepreneurship at the regional level. And so interestingly, what we find is that the dispersion of wages following such laws really increases significantly within firms as well, within an established firms as well. And so it's something that we would rarely think about, because we often think about the direct impact of entrepreneurship, but this impact can also be indirect, and it happens through affecting the wages and the salaries of people inside firms. Now, the question is why? And so what we find is essentially that entrepreneurship, when it becomes easier, when it becomes cheaper, offers a really attractive, credible outside option for workers inside firms. And so all of a sudden, if you can leave and create a new venture more cheaply, you do have an outside option that often your employer is going to take into consideration, and they're going to particularly take it into consideration when you are a more valuable and more high-performing worker. So of course, those who are lower performers might also benefit from lower barriers to entrepreneurship. But the tricky part here is that employers might not be willing to respond to this outside option, because it's just not particularly profitable for them to increase salaries for workers who are in the first place not productive. But for those high performers, employers will actually propose, or they will concede, a higher salary in retention efforts. And so this kind of micro level increase in bargaining of top performers then leads to a widened distribution of wages in incumbent firms. And so in this project, we actually found that if you think about increases in regional wage inequality following a fall in barriers to entrepreneurship, 1/3 of it should be accounted for by what happens within incumbent firms. And so to me, that's actually quite interesting, because we often do focus on these direct effects of entrepreneurship on inequality, but actually how it affects this internal dynamic in the firm and how it indirectly might contribute to inequality is this overlooked mechanism that might be important as well in terms of actually tackling the implications of entrepreneurship for regional or community stability that might be related to inequality. It's really most important to make sure that this is a career that suits you, because this is not a sprint. PhD is just the beginning. It's really a marathon, and it's a long-term commitment. Academia has its upsides as well as its downsides, and in some ways it requires a lot of commitment. It gives you a lot of flexibility as well, but I think it is important to really spend part of your PhD really trying to understand what it takes. What is this job about, and will I actually enjoy it, and will I be able to manage and tackle some of the challenges that come with it, as well as, of course, enjoy all the benefits that academia bestows on individuals. And so I do think that really thinking very carefully about this job-person match is the first step. Now, I think having discovered that, having kind of more confidence that this is the right fit for you, I think the other important piece of it is that, I think a lot of academia is about really finding not only a project for your dissertation, so not only thinking about the dissertation, but really finding a research agenda that can sustain you for many years to come. And so it shouldn't be, I guess, a narrow question that you can just apply to your dissertation and be done with it. But if you're really thinking about academia long term, then I think it's beneficial to also think bigger and think about those larger questions that can then result in multiple projects that can, as we said before, that can really pique your curiosity and can foster your commitment. And so so I think the PhD years are precisely the time to do that, because once you're done with your PhD, then all of a sudden you're bombarded with many other commitments, administrative, you have to teach and all of that. And so really the PhD years are those amazing, protected, sheltered years when you have time to think. You really have the time, and you should take the time to find what you truly like, something that you deeply care about. Now, having said that, I often do see people asking if there is at all any pivots after the dissertation. And I think my view on this is that yes, absolutely. So while these PhD years do define in some ways who you are, they do help you really figure out your distinct identity. Nevertheless, the dissertation is not a marriage. And so I think as you progress in your career, it's also completely viable to pivot, and people often pivot from various phenomena to other phenomena, from this theory to another theory. And so in that sense, I think academia gives you a lot of flexibility and a lot of latitude to really figure out what it is that works for you. And I think the beauty of it is that there's not just one way, right? And so I think everyone can really carve their own pathway, a unique pursuit that really works for them. I always thought that it's important to find 3 people you should be able to talk to. And so one of them is essentially a person who you can bounce off early ideas. So early ideas are ideas that are not yet developed, they have a lot of flaws, they are not perfect, and so you really need someone who you trust, who can give you honest feedback, and who can help you advance your thinking while also providing this security of the early stage. Because if you, of course, bring an early stage idea to a broader public, then you might have this experience of the idea being shut down, it's not ready yet, you don't have answers, and so often it wouldn't be a really good idea. You actually want to protect it for a longer time. But I think at the same time, you want to counterbalance that against the ability to get feedback. And so this is where finding someone you really trust, so it could be your PhD colleague, it could be someone in your family who is like willing to listen about your research, but finding someone who might play that role, I think, is really important, so that you can quickly iterate on things and you don't waste tremendous amount of time with ideas that don't really have the potential. So that's the first person, and presumably the most important one. Now, the second person you should find should be that person who is ready for the developed idea. And I think that often could be your mentor, it could be someone else, people in your department, but people who can still give you honest feedback, but they're willing to really vet ideas that are much better developed, much more far along. And so having really those people you can go to would be very important as well. And then I think the third person that I wouldn't sort of I can't emphasize enough their importance would be someone who can provide emotional support, because we all need a lot of emotional support. This is a profession that has a very high rejection rate, right? Think about the R&D process. In fact, some of the very senior scholars in this profession, I heard them talk about having every single paper rejected before it actually got published. So we have very successful people who admit to having gone through that experience. And so if you really think that this is going to be all rosy and smooth, for most people it's not. Even for very, very successful people, it's not. And so I think in that sense, having the perspective and having someone who will offer that emotional support and will understand that that's sort of the name of the game. The name of the game is rejection, and you have to kind of learn to deal with that. I think that really makes all the difference if you can have those 3 people. And I think the last thing that I would say that's related to this is that just the ability ability to seek feedback and to also act on feedback is something that I can't emphasize enough. I think developing a thick skin might be one way of thinking about it and not taking things personally. It's not about you. It's not about anything personal. It's about an idea. We're in a profession where we're discussing ideas, and while critique sometimes might seem really, really hard to take, I think really distancing yourself from it and being able to develop the skills to take feedback and to act on feedback. So this is a profession where I think it's a long time or sort of long run conversation that we're in, rather than any particular fight that you win. And so thinking about it as kind of having conversations about ideas with various people, even if the experience might feel sometimes unpleasant, either because you're giving a seminar where people are sort of asking questions that you weren't expecting, or maybe a particular presentation doesn't go well. I think really thinking about it as, well, I'm in a conversation with these people about particular ideas, and I'm always learning. I'm having this growth mindset. I think it's difficult to do, but if you can take feedback and act on it, I think it will make a great deal of a difference in your career.